First of all, welcome to Earth Observation Australia's first meeting for this year. I'm Stuart Finn from the University of Queensland. So for everybody who's just jumped in the last minute or two, if you do have any questions, please type them into the chat window and we'll stop and respond to them as well. Unfortunately, I can't see those directly while I'm sharing my screen at the moment, so I might need Joe to remind me if we get any questions. Just in terms of what I said before, we will ask people to keep their microphones on mute while we're doing the presentations. We will have some open discussion sections and we'll open up the microphones then as well. And we are recording essentially the audio and then also the screen component of this for later on. So again, thanks everybody for coming along today, and we'll get going so we can keep this on time. So just in terms of the agenda for today, first thing just to go over what we're going to get out of today and a bit of context about Earth Observation Australia and the plan and how it's going to fit together. The second part of today is how we're moving forward with implementing that 10-year plan. So we've moved to establishing a steering committee and a series of working groups, and we'll spend 10 or so minutes just explaining how they're planning to function and also talking about some of the possible funding. After that, we'll have a range of status and update sections covering the dot points, which are mentioned there, and we'll have a number of other people presenting as part of that. And in both sections 2 and 3, there are time for people to ask questions and clarify points. And then we'll sort of finish with, what the next steps are in terms of implementing the plan, and some other key activities, what our meeting schedule is for the year, take any other points for business, and then close just before 12 o'clock, I guess, Eastern Standard Time. And I guess the minutes and action items and recordings for this will be available on the Earth Observation Australia website over the next couple of days. So again, I'd just like to acknowledge and thank Joe Edkins for helping us put this together, and also some of the background funding that we received for doing this from Geoscience Australia and the Joint Remote Sensing Research Program. Okay, so just a bit of context to remind us of where we're going over the next year and beyond. The vision of that community plan that you can see in front of you is essentially that by 2026 we'll have a multifaceted sensor that's developing and delivering Earth observation information, the associated infrastructure and services, and they're widely used in Australia and internationally. And the key component of that is the little Venn diagram on the right there out of the plan. And essentially what this organisation is attempting to do is to get the key people from government agencies, particularly at state and Commonwealth level, people in research and education institutions, private industry and NGOs, establish how they're using Earth observation, how they need to move forward, and help build a coordinated capacity where government funding is directed into the right areas that is going to enable research and education in this space. So we've got a skilled workforce, but also that there are appropriate programs in place such that industry can leverage on that government investment, have a good pool of people to draw on in terms of a future skilled labour force, and place themselves to establish national and international markets. So we're trying to establish a more coordinated set of activities excuse me, across those areas and reduce the overlap. And there's a lot of activities going on at the moment that are going to help us get there. So the plan document, which was developed from consultation across the community, is a coordinated set of actions in 5 priorities, which are going to advance our capability in Earth observation. So again, the activities of Earth Observation Australia are driven by that plan, and will, as you see in a minute, the structure and approach we're taking will build on that. So implementing that 10-year plan. So what are its priorities? How's it going to operate? What does the steering committee do? What are the working groups doing, and how do we engage with this? So at the moment we have a business plan which transitioned us from the coordinating group to Earth Observation Australia, and that sets out sort of stages over the next basically 2, 5 and 10 years for going from a essentially ad hoc volunteer organisation to one which is formally structured and run, and which is able to access and use funding to support its activities. And I'd like to thank Glenn Campbell and others for helping to draw together that plan and to make it work. What we've done towards the end of last year is take some of the key components of that plan and set up a steering committee, which I'll explain in a minute. And then we're also moved to establishing working groups as well. I'll explain the difference between those two entities in a minute. We have a draft steering committee document, which will actually transition to be a steering committee and working group document. So these two documents, which are online on the website, are going to guide what we're actually doing and establish the appropriate governance within Earth Observation Australia. Essentially what we're focusing on is figuring out how we address those 5 priorities. So those are the 5 priorities that come out of the plan. They, as I said before, came from consultation across government, industry and research. The community has identified those. It wasn't a group of people sitting down and going, well, what's the best thing that we can do? We went out to all the different communities, looked at reports that were published and collated those into sets of information which grouped nicely into those 5 key priority areas. So when we talk about implementing the plan, it's going to be delivering on each of those 5 priorities. And as we measure progress over time, it will be how we're tracking towards achieving each of those 5 priorities there at the moment. One of the things in establishing Earth Observation Australia, which is in the business plan and also the steering committee and working groups document, is how we intend to function. And it's in other national groups where we're trying to do things collectively and collaboratively. It's really important that we're quite explicit about how we're actually working. And a number of these have come out of the Australian Ecosystem Science Council and have been modified from experience to date. So this is essentially how this community is going to work together. We do have a shared vision, so we recognise that we're working for the greater good. We have strength in diversity, and that diversity is across institutional settings, people in different career stages, and different types of focuses and approaches. So, we're not out for a one-size-fits-all approach. We are trying to include different areas and make sure we do that properly. We will, I guess, always strive to be positive and innovative in what we do, given that often there are things that are quite challenging to deal with. Focus on having effective communication. These webinars, our website and records of meetings an example of having effective communication, but also making sure that we can I guess, listen to others. And that the reason for setting up this process is that we can distribute the tasks so that it's not myself sort of pushing these meetings forward after this point, that there's a group of people invested in doing it and who will be delivering on these things as well. That it's reliable and trustworthy, that when people commit to doing things, they do them. It's collaborative and supportive, and that we're also able to be accountable. And that accountability comes back to those are the 5 things that we're looking to actually achieve, and we'll do it using those approaches. Okay, I just want to go to the steering committee and the working groups. We asked people to nominate for steering committee membership, and a smaller group went through and selected steering committees, people and working group. And what we're trying to do is get a balance of people across the country, across different organisations, across different career stages there, so that we could fit things together. So we have done that. The only change to the steering committee at the moment is we have invited a representative of the Defence Forces who is specifically engaged with image collection, analysis and distribution to be part of the steering committee, and we're just waiting for official approval. So there'll be a representative of Defence in there once the steering committee actually gets going as well. The steering committee has a series of what are best referred to as oversight tasks, and those 6 tasks are listed there. So I guess the development and implementation of these whole of community webinars is going to be one of those things, and that we would look at sharing that role across the committee. So facilitating communication and coordination is one of the roles. The second thing is coordinating the delivery of activities in the community 10-year plan and our business plan. So that's working with the working groups, who are actually going to be the ones assigned to each individual priority. But the steering committee is going to provide the glue that lets the priorities and those activities sit together and make sure they collectively address what we're doing in the community plan. The steering committee will also be responsible for seeking resources, as in the financial kind and otherwise, to help us perform what we've set out in the business plan. So there's a funding sort of component there. The steering committee will also review our progress towards the goals and the community plan and the business plan. They'll contribute to the webinars, as I said, and also because of what we're doing in Earth Observation Australia, we'd ask the steering committee members to represent Earth Observation Australia at a range of activities dealing with Earth observation, and hopefully activities associated with Australia's Space Agency. So the steering committee has, I guess, oversight coordination roles to begin with. And if you look at the business plan, the steering committee is that first stage of formal governance as well. I might pause there for a moment and then just go back to the group to see if there were any questions about the nature of the steering committee. So I guess, Joe, if you can enable people's microphones, and I'll just make sure everyone stays on mute. If you do have a question about steering committee, maybe could you just type that into the chat window, or basically unmute yourself and ask the question. So, and I guess while there's silence, I assume nothing is actually happening in that context. Cool. All right. Well, if there's no questions at the moment, what we'll do now is just progress on to the next bit. Here we go. Okay, working groups. So this is an initial seeding of the working groups with the people in asterisks identified as the preliminary chairs of these. And like the steering committee, we wanted a balance of people across organisations, across the country, across career stages, to make sure that we could cover off on what we wanted to do here. The working groups, essentially there is one working group for each of the 5 priorities which are in the plan. So just to remind you, whoops, those are the 5 priorities: connection and coordination, securing our role internationally, infrastructure and people, access to EO data and services, and generating value. Each of those priorities has an individual working group, and that is the group of people who are working out how we're going to address what the plan sets out for each priority. If you look at the online version of the plan, each of those priorities has a substantive outline about what the priority is, how to start addressing it, and then outside of the plan we have a series of summary documentation based on the national consultations that outline how various groups around the country think that we could start to address each of those priorities in terms of individual projects. So just to be clear, the working groups aren't starting with a blank slate on how do you do this. The community plan document has an overview of how to do that, and then we have some quite detailed information on activities that the working groups could implement. So what we're essentially asking the working groups to do is to develop an implementation strategy which will include timelines and requested resourcing to start to address the priority that they're assigned to in the plan. That implementation strategy will follow a set template so that can be built up, sent back to the steering committee to look at and make sure everything sits together. So the steering committee will have an oversight role with each of the working groups to make sure that the way that they're progressing isn't necessarily overlapping or duplicating, that they're working in a complementary manner. And then when we put together their implementation strategies, they are going to achieve what we actually need to. It also means the steering committee can have a better sense of what resourcing is required to do it. So once each working group establishes its implementation strategy, they'll move forward with actually doing it. They'll obviously engage with the steering committee and the Secretariat for Earth Observation Australia to obtain resourcing to actually do that. So where we are at the moment is that we have a steering committee, we have the starting points of the working groups. Within the next month, the working groups will have outlines of the implementation strategy that they will have to build in terms of a template and draft structure, and they'll then move towards setting up larger working groups and sets of activities over the rest of the year. So I guess I might stop there again just at that point and go back to everyone in the group. So now we've explained the steering committees and the working groups and how the working group focuses on each priority. Was there any questions about the nature of that? And that could be everything to do with what tasks they're going to do, how are we going to deal with funding, and what's the timing on that. So I guess I'll open it up to everyone again. If you've got a question, type it in or unmute your microphone and we can have a discussion about it.
Hi, this is Arnold.
Yep,
Can you
go for it, Arnold.
hear me? Yeah, okay, good. So I was recently invited to participate in the summer school for Satellite Remote Sensing Summer School at the University of Sydney, and I was speaking to Warwick Holmes and Peter Moore. And of course, I've been talking to Russell Boyce, and I've heard Andrew Dempster, and we have a high altitude spectral sensing or sensor systems program in DMTC, Defense Materials Technological Corporation, where 2 CubeSats, maybe 2 imaging spectrometry CubeSats may be developed. And we have got CubeSat companies now also in Australia. And I was talking to Warwick and Peter, and I realized that they should actually be part of Earth Observation Australia as well, because their drive is, let's say, technology push, and from a very good, very solid background in having done that. But there are others that are also doing technology push that want sensors built in Australia and funded by the Australian government. And at the moment, they're not engaged with Earth Observation Australia, although I did suggest it to them. And I do think we need to, it's a component that we need to think about how to engage to get them to, let's say, be involved in Earth Observation Australia. But I think Earth Observation Australia should also reach out to them. Because if we don't, we've got this disconnect between people pushing sensor technologies, but not talking to the end user community, both the scientific and, let's say, governmental and industrial end user community. So, yeah, I'm just raising this issue as something I think we need to address, and maybe that falls under the infrastructure working group, and I'm happy to contribute there.
Sure. Cool. Thanks very much, Arnold. I think we'll take that as an action item, and I'll turn that around a little bit and say, so Arnold, if you could send in contact details for those people to Joe and myself, and if anyone else on the webinar thinks of others who are in a position like that where they're not engaging with Earth Observation Australia, but it would help for us to invite them and bring them along, I'd greatly appreciate that. I mean, there's a little bit of an item on this later on, because there are discussions about a potential centre of excellence in terms of space business activities, where there'll be an upstream and as in building and launching satellites and sensors component, and a downstream applications component. The people running that have reached out to us, but in saying that, I'm aware there are other initiatives like that going on around the country that are quite large scale, and it's important that we're able to link into those and offer to work with them as well. Cool. All right. Thanks, Arnold. Any other questions or points of clarification? I just responded to a question from John O'Ross there about additional contributors. Most definitely we're going to need more contributors. I think that will happen towards the end of April, once each of the people setting up those working groups know that roughly the structure and how they might proceed there. But they're definitely going to have to get bigger to address those tasks as well. Cool. All right. Any other questions, points of clarification there? All right. Okay. If people do think of them as we keep going through the webinar, please type them in or email them to us afterwards, and we'll follow up as well. Okay. Well, I might just hop back to the presentation. Okay, current status and engagement activities as well. So there's a number of things listed there. We'll just work through those. And this actually relates a bit to the point Arnold just mentioned. These are some of the key ones which we know are affecting Earth Observation Australia, or they've engaged with us so far. And I guess once we get to the end of this, there's opportunity for people to add in. In terms of the Space Agency, I understand that the expert working group for that is meant to release their formal report in March. I understand a draft of that's already been done, and we're likely to see a focus on supporting industry in this area as well. Once this is released, or once we actually have enough information, I think it's quite important that as a group we do digest that and look constructively for the areas to engage with that and attempt to formalise things as soon as possible in that context as well. So hopefully we're going to hear about this quite soon, and it should be a positive outcome in relation to helping to get Earth Observation Australia or Earth observation activities going as well. I don't know if anyone wanted to add any more details to that at the moment. All right, well, we might come back to that later. So, okay, okay, all right, okay, next item. This is an area that we haven't interacted with previously, but towards the end of last year and the beginning of this year, through a number of events, particularly Science Meets Business and the Australian Space Conference at the University of Sydney, it's become clear that there's an increased amount of activity in defence around the capture, analysis and distribution of Earth observation data at much larger scales than before. So in terms of if people wanted more of a background on this and how the government is looking at approaching it, there's a white paper and associated industry policy statement online which are worth having a look at. And if you have a look particularly into the policy statement, I did want to show this diagram particularly because of what's on the right-hand side here. The white paper and associated documents outlines what the priorities are in terms of capability, force design, technology foresighting. The key thing is there's now a number of initiatives that enable defence to engage with research in universities, organisations like CSIRO, SME and large companies and industry growth centres. So there is now this sort of interface which there were parts of it in place before, but it wasn't as well developed. And there's a significant component of what Defence wants to look at that's in relation to Earth observation. So this is partly the drive behind having a representative on our steering committee from the Defence component within government, and hopefully we can build a better understanding of their needs and potentials for collaboration and also dual use technologies in those areas. So that's the Defence part of it. National Collaborative Research Infrastructure. So the diagram on the screen that you can see is essentially a skeleton framework for a proposal that went in for a research infrastructure facility to support calibration, validation of Earth observation activities in Australia, and also significantly developed infrastructure and support for going from experimental activities to making them operational. So this was submitted in August last year, along with all of the other NCRIS facility resubmissions. So for those of you who are familiar with TERN, IMOS, the Integrated Marine Observing System, AusScope, all of those groups put in basically quite detailed bids to access funding over a 5 and 10 year period. We were told the initial decisions for this would be made at the mid-year budget statement in November. The government was unable to complete their evaluations by that point. I understand those evaluations are still ongoing, and that the announcement about NCRIS funding and whether this initiative and the next versions of turn IMOS, Ozscope and others continue won't happen until the actual budget release in the middle of this year. So it's unfortunate that we didn't find out at the end of last year where this is actually going. Hopefully we'll hear what's going to happen by the middle of this year. I'll make sure there's a summary version of this proposal up on the Earth Observation Australia website over the next week so people can see it, particularly as we have a number of groups submitting large-scale, research infrastructure proposals through the Australian Research Council at the moment that would benefit from interacting with that. So I might stop there at the NCRIS side and just ask if there are any questions from people about collaborative research infrastructure. All right, if there's not, we'll move on. Okay, I did want to put a slide in there about Digital Earth Australia as this initiative is progressing at the moment. So there's essentially a trial portal out there. Hopefully at follow-on meetings, we'll have more of an update of what's happening with this. I understand at the moment Geoscience Australia is hosting the International Open Data Cube meetings in Canberra, so we have a number of people not attending because of that. So I think in future we'll make sure that initiatives like this do have a reporting slot so we know what's happening, and that some of the coordination activities around it are also made known to the broader community. One of those coordination activities you'll hear about through Earth Observation Australia is the Earth Observation for Government Network. This is going to be a set of activities which will bring together research agencies and Commonwealth agencies to look at national and larger mapping and monitoring needs, and how Earth observation imagery can be applied to deliver new products for that. So you'll see some notices coming out soon about the initial workshops for this, which will be targeted around a number of key already established national needs. And the aim is for each of these just to establish, a plan for the collection and delivery of these operational national data sets, which we don't have in place at the moment. Spatial Agenda 2026, this is through mainly the CRC for spatial information and a range of other professional groups working in this area. Like our 10-year plan, they also have a 10-year plan. They have an action plan that's been released, and I understand they're on the way to implementing that. This does have an Earth observation component to it, so I'm hoping that we have updates from the people running this in future, because it will affect some of our national initiatives. Okay, might just switch over now to international engagement. Jonathan Ross from Geoscience Australia has agreed to give us an update on some of their international coordination activities, particularly around the Committee on Earth Observation Satellites. And after that, I may ask Paul Nugent, if he's online, to say a few words about an upcoming activity across a range of eastern state cities for engaging with the European Commission to access funding for Earth observation. Cool. So, Jono, can I hand it over to you now?
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. That's great. Can you make me presenter, or?
Yeah, I'll just get... Are you able to see that? I've got your slide there.
Yeah, I can see it. Or you can click it if you like.
Yeah, is that all right?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, cool. I'll just sit on mute.
Yep, go to the next one. Oh, you'll have to click a few. I think I've got the animations on. All right. So in terms of the two main multilateral fora we work through, CEOS and GEO. In CEOS, the European Commission is chairing CEOS this year. They've never done that before. And I guess that reflects the fact that Copernicus and Galileo are both very big, significant operational programs, and they're really stepping up in areas where they haven't before. Some of the priorities they're driving this year include greenhouse gas observation from space, this analysis-ready data agenda, which also Australia has been pushing, and big space data. They're priority topics. So a lot of the discussion in CEOS is around those. As Stuart mentioned, the Open Data Cube conference is on in Canberra this week. The community is still evolving, but the number of developers, the number of people around the world deploying the software, and the number of people using it is increasing. Certainly this year's event is a lot bigger, and the relevance to CEOS there is there's this CEOS Data Cube activity where space agencies are working together to get the software deployed into countries with a bit of a focus on the sustainable development goals. And one of the aims there is to strengthen the engagement with the World Bank in terms of them seeing this kind of activity, this exploitation of EO data in these countries as a real development opportunity. And they're engaged, but there's certainly work to do on that. In terms of the group on Earth observation, which looks more generally at Earth observation beyond space, the three strategic priorities GEO's working on are the Sustainable Development Goals, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, the so-called Big Three international agreements that all came out at around the same time. So there's a lot of emphasis on how can we leverage existing projects and apply them to the specific objectives of those frameworks. A bit closer to home, one of the things GEO's done over recent years is say, well, we need to look at things globally, but it would also be good if there was increased regional cooperation. So there's an African regional initiative, there's an American one, and now there's one in our region as well called Asia Oceania GEOS. And the goal of that is to bring the countries in the region together to improve data sharing and collaboration and development of applications. Australia is one of the co-leads of that, along with Japan and China, and we're hoping that some of the areas where we've had trouble making progress with some of our neighbours globally might be easier when it's broken down to a more regional level. And Australia is now on the new GEO program board, which is the body that looks over the work program. And one of our goals in that will be to connect more of our community, researchers, industry, and so on, into GEO projects. There's a lot of Australians already participating in GEO, but we'd like to see more. Yeah, USGS. So on our side, we're already providing downlink and uplink support for Landsat 8, and we've just confirmed that we will also provide that for Landsat 9 when it launches. So we're very heavily involved in the development process for Landsat 9 with NASA and USGS. And as I think everyone on the call probably knows, Landsat 9 will essentially be a copy of Landsat 8, although they will address some of the issues that they've had with particularly the thermal instrument on Landsat 8. But the thinking there is already around what happens post Landsat 9. We don't say Landsat 10 because we don't know if it will be a Landsat 10. It might be a constellation. It could be all sorts of different things. But USGS and NASA are really working very hard on those requirements and options, and pretty much everything's on the table at this stage. One of the things they're reaching out to us for, and that we'll be reaching out to the community for, is they really want community input. And what they're really particularly interested in is non-traditional applications. So certainly they understand the absolute critical importance of continuity in what Landsat has done and continues to do. But with all these options they're looking at, they want to know what other things could be done. And work like the study that Arnold was recently involved in on water quality are exactly the kinds of inputs that they're looking for. And one of the things we're looking at is, with Australia stepping up through the space agency, what opportunities might there be for Australia to co-invest in those missions beyond Landsat 9? And I think there's one more there, yeah. Probably users of Landsat data have noticed USGS is shifting to a collections approach, so a much more structured approach to how they release their data. Collection 1 is out now, but really people should be looking at Collection 2, which is in the planning planning stages, where the default product will be a global analysis-ready product, a global high-quality surface reflectance product. And one of the decisions they're really looking for input on right now is what projection should be used for that. So obviously there's a whole range of things they're looking at in the definition of those products, but this is one where they're really looking for input. Do they stick with UTM, or do they shift to something a bit more exotic?
Sorry, John, could I just interrupt for a sec? That's actually something that we sent out a week or two ago, as you noted. I'll get it sent out again tomorrow because we've had quite good feedback so far. And then the chair of that group has been very positive in responding to us, saying, can you please make sure you ask people about what they actually really want, particularly for large area, long time series. So,
great.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, great. They really do listen, as Stuart says. They really do take this stuff on board. Next one. This next one's about Copernicus. Sentinel-3B launch is imminent. It's coming up. If six types of Sentinels weren't enough for you, they're now looking at the next 6 types of Sentinels. So they've got studies on what they call possible Sentinel next generation missions. So the continuity of the families that exist now, the 1s to 6s, is pretty much assured, subject to, I guess, Brexit blowing a hole in the EU budget, but everyone over there wants that to continue. What they're looking at now is expansion of the portfolio of missions, and the 6 that they're looking at specifically are there. I think there's some Australians involved in some of those, but there are some quite strict rules around participants needing to be from member states for some of these studies that they're doing now. But looking at that list, I'm sure our community would see some stuff they're pretty interested in, particularly if the open data policy continues. Next, our regional data hub, which we maintain as a contribution to the Commission and also to help our own community. We've had trouble for a while getting that data over here, but we've now reached nominal performance. We're now keeping up pretty reliably with the new data as it's published, but we've still got a watching brief because there's a whole bunch of data from Sentinel-3A that's going to come online and Sentinel-3B still to come, and all these other missions as well. So we think that that will be an ongoing challenge, but one with our partners, CSIRO, Queensland, New South Wales and WA, we'll keep working on. And the last point, you might start hearing about this DAS. This is the Data Access and Information Service. One of the main things that the Europeans are worried about is they produce all this data and then all the benefit goes to the big US companies, the Amazons and Googles and those sorts of people. Recognizing that, they let out a tender to set up these basically these cloud computing platforms with value-added services on top to try and get European companies into that space where they're providing these platforms that applications are then built on top of. So they have awarded 4 contracts to 4 separate industrial consortia to build DASs. And the proposed date for them to be operationally available is July 2018. In terms of what functionality they will offer that we might want to take advantage of, detail is basically non-existent at this stage. That information is still being treated as commercial in confidence, but we're hoping we'll get more information soon. And one more, and I think a theme that we'll see a lot from them is the Commission generally is much more interested in defence and security now. It's a competence they've been more active in recently. It never used to be something that the European Union was much interested in, but now defence and security is getting a lot of interest, and that is flowing into Copernicus as well. They're looking at what might Copernicus missions or data look like to support security and defence needs. Thanks, Stuart. Just one more. Some really good news coming out of Japan. Certainly some of the JAXA data sets have been open for a while, but they are moving much more in an open and free data direction. Essentially anything that is 10 meters or over, their plan is to make it full free and open. And there is a slightly confusing line on this chart under ALOS too, but what it will mean is there's going to be a whole lot more data coming from ALOS, ALOS 2, and then the ALOS optical mission when it comes as well. And that is very good news for us. We'd seen that opening up over the last couple of years, but now that is essentially adopted policy from Japan. So that's hopefully a good reason for more people to take advantage of that data. And that's all I had, Stuart. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks very much, Jono. Cool. Okay. Before I go to other activities, Paul Nugent's online. Paul, are you there?
Yes, Stuart.
Do you want to say just a few words about the upcoming engagement activities around H2020 and the delegation that's visiting?
Yes, certainly. There's been an opportunistic group of representatives from CRCSI, Geoscience Australia, CSIRO, Earth Observation Australia, and several others who don't come immediately to mind. We have a visit from the European Commissioner Bienkowska coming to Australia in early March, and the opportunity of the visit has been married with a trade mission from the European Association of Remote Sensing Companies who are coming out to Australia. There is a series of events that have been put in place to run in Brisbane, Canberra and Sydney the week of the 5th of March, inviting industry in Australia to attend and network and hopefully commence building collaborative relationships with European companies. One of the catalysts is the Horizon 2020 program in Europe, which is an $80 billion program, and part of that there's a call that has been announced coming out in October this year for proposals from joint collaborations between EU companies and Australian companies or US companies to put up proposals for downstream applications for the Copernicus data. And hopefully this will prove to be a strong catalyst to encourage collaborative discussions. Details for the events are announced on the CRCSI website. They're going up, I think, today, Stuart. Joe's putting them up as news, and also in the Horizon 2020 work program section of the Earth Observation Australia website. So I'd encourage everyone to pass on information to their colleagues about this opportunity. It has unfortunately been on a very short time frame to get the information out to everybody. So I'd encourage you to go to the site and follow up with more detailed information.
Cool. All right. Thanks very much, Paul. And yeah, you're right. We'll have that information posted hopefully later today on the Earth Observation Australia webpage, and we'll also do a mail out to everybody to explain what's happening. All right. So I just wanted to come close to finishing just by going out to the group of people who are online. And this can be a response either by typing into the comments or a verbal one. If you're aware of other large-scale research proposals at the moment, so I'm not talking about individual projects using, I guess, satellite, airborne or drone data. I'm talking about, excuse me, multi-institutional projects looking at, either developing or building satellites and sensors, or developing or building coordinated downstream applications. I think it's quite important now that we try to maintain an awareness of what's going on across the country. And as just part of that context, I mean, the CRC Spatial's obviously transitioning to a new mode of operations, and that's partly what the Spatial Agenda 2026 is about. So we'll see that change, and there's likely to be more Earth observation in that context. As I mentioned before, there is a an initial draft proposal for a Centre of Excellence for Space type business that's likely to be UNSW, Sydney University focused, that's upstream and downstream. There's the infrastructure bids I mentioned in there, but I guess I'd be interested to hear if there are any other large-scale activities that people have got there. Right, I just noticed, it's a question from Deanna Hutchinson at SEBA about Digital Earth Node and Cheryl Desha. I've had several discussions with Cheryl, and I think this comes into the context of what Arnold said before, where I think if we actively reach out to groups like Digital Earth, I think we'll be a bit more effective. So thanks for suggesting that, Deanna. Any other questions or thoughts? In Digital Earth is a good example of a large-scale collaboration there. And I guess if we don't have any at the moment and you think of anything later on, I mean, please feel free to email them in as well. All right. So just in terms of next steps, at the steering committee and working group level, we're finalising the document that explains how those two groups will function, how they'll interact with one another, and the level of support which they're going to get. As part of that, I think as alluded to earlier, we will need to look at expanding the working groups, and I would hope that would start happening in April once they all have an idea of what the main things are that they would like to actually do. So that's sort of the main high-level steps. The short-term response steps are in relation to the Space Agency announcements and also anything to do with large-scale research infrastructure. As soon as we hear any developments about that, we'll come back to the community as a whole as an update, and also most probably asking for input. Aside from that, we are trying to put date claimers in for our whole of community meetings. So as you can see there's a range of dates basically running every sort of 2 to 3 months through to the end of the year. We have tried to time those to avoid major holidays, and also so that we can have people from both the east and west sides of the country attending our meetings as well. So please make sure you put those in your calendars and keep an eye on the website. Oops. Okay, and I think just a point from Arnold, actually, Arnold's point is about the new US decadal plan for Earth observation. Arnold's point about imaging spectrometry as a key priority, which is quite important. I think what I'll do in response to that, Arnold, is actually distribute the summary decadal plan for people to look at, because there's a number of, I guess, interesting shifts with what NASA considers critical in relation to science missions in terms of data types, but also their shift towards different types of satellites and sensors in future. So I guess an action item for me from the meeting is to basically get a copy of that plan. Yeah, and I know if Australia supports it, it will get a higher priority. So I think, Arnold, that's a discussion that we might want to follow up on after this. Alex Held and myself had a discussion with Greg Asner about one potential way of doing that a little while ago, and I think it would be good if we could open up that discussion a bit more. So I guess that's 2 action items: a follow-up on the plan, and then a discussion group about imaging spectrometry and its developments, because that also has some quite, I think, direct links to commercial developments in future which are being planned. So, cool. Okay. Any other items of business?
Yeah, Stuart, it's Tim Malthus here. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, go for it, Tim.
Great. It was just to follow up on the email that you put out on my behalf on the IOCCG meeting, the International Ocean Colour Coordination meeting. I'm asking for materials. I'm collating that material. So that meeting takes place in the first week of March. I'm collating those materials this afternoon and tomorrow. So if people have stuff they still want to get to me, please email tim.malthus@csiro.au.
All right, we might just send that email out. So just as a reminder, IOCCG is the international collection of countries, organisations dealing with ocean colour and other surface ocean measurements. They're very effective in influencing the space agencies around the world in terms of sensor development, algorithm development and testing. They're also quite active in publishing resources for people to use in this area. So I guess I'd encourage people to respond to Tim. I think, Tim, I had given some material to David Antoine about the infrastructure facility proposal and that. So hopefully that gets through to you.
Yeah, I've got some material, David, already.
Okay, cool. Okay,
Great.
Good. Thanks, Tim. Any other points that people want to raise?
Just if there's experience with the Horizon 2020 proposals in the community, it would be really helpful to understand their experience to date to share with others at the coming events.
Okay, so I think, thanks, Paul. So I think what we'll do in the minutes and the follow-up email is ask that as a direct question. I guess given the nature of the forms and other things associated with those proposals and working with European agencies, it would be good to have people who've had experience. I think one thing to mention is that we are going to get support from I guess representatives in the Australian government and others who have had experience with these sorts of proposals, but we would also want to hear from people in the community on that too. Cool. All right. Thanks, Paul. Okay, great. Well, I think that takes us to the end of today's meeting. Thanks everybody for your time and input. I do hope this is going to be one of the last meetings where you're going to hear me for most of the time, and hopefully at the ones in future, you're going to hear from a range of steering committee, working group people and others as well. And just a reminder, everyone should have got a chat message from Joe Edkins that there's an exit survey here as well. So cool. All right, and thanks, Michael, for that little note about the H2020 Ag meeting in Brisbane. So thanks everybody for your time and commitment. And basically we're now rolling with doing work. So look forward to interacting with everyone in future. Cool. And thanks, Joe, for running today. So with that, I'll close the meeting.